So we're going to make sense of the trend of the E in ESG. So the first question that I'd like to talk about is, what actually is ESG? And I had this great intro. It's environmental, social, and governance. And we're mostly going to talk about the E part in the ESG. But it's often kind of used to refer to everything that is climate and money related. You'll hear, I'm the anti-ESG candidate. I think that was the new thing that the next presidential candidate just announced. And so a lot of things are referred to as ESG when maybe they're not necessarily ESG. And so I put a couple examples up here. I know a very recent one was the governor of this state announced legislation to protect Floridians from the woke ESG financial scam. What in the world does that mean? And so I listed a bunch of things that have been referred to as ESG. We've got divestment, debanking, climate lawsuits, climate regulations, legislation to ban internal combustion engine vehicles, sustainable investing, socially responsible investing. All of those things have been, referred to as ESG. Mostly what we're going to talk about today are the investment part, and as opposed to, say, divestment and debanking or climate lawsuits or climate regulations. So I will talk a little bit, touch on some of them. Divestment is kind of a part of, I would say, ESG, because sometimes you'll hear of very prominent organizations. For example, the Harvard University Management Company actually announced in September of 2021 that they would no longer, they would have no direct investments in companies that explore for or develop further reserves of fossil fuels, and that their managers do not intend to make such investments in the future. So a lot of people interpreted that to mean, oh, they're now divesting, or they're divested from fossil fuels. But what does that really mean? They were very careful not to use the term divest. And part of the reason is that the HMC still has a lot of legacy investments in, as a limited partner in a number of private equity funds that have holdings in the fossil fuel industry. These were things that maybe were bequeathed to them by alumni, and so they're not prominent. They're less than 2% of Harvard's endowment, but they're still there. So they can't technically say that they have divested from fossil fuels. So I think it's important to understand exactly what people are talking about when they say they've divested from fossil fuels, or they're going to, or they're going to be ESG now. When we talk about debanking, that's a really big buzzword today, and that's when banks refuse to provide services to an entire industry based on the desires of activists. And some of industries that have experienced debanking in recent years include private prison operators, gun makers, and yes, oil and gas companies. Now, banks tend to claim that the reason for this is kind of these vaguely articulated risks associated with the industry, but really it has much more to do with political and ideological pressure and risks to the bank's perceived reputation. So they don't really think that this whole industry is like, somehow like the riskiest thing in the world. They're more concerned about their own image. With regards to oil and gas, debanking has definitely started to occur in some aspects, particularly with regards to drilling in the Arctic. Some of the largest banks in the US have said they're not going to fund any new exploration or production projects in the Arctic. That's really kind of a statement, though, that doesn't really have much teeth, because nobody really wants to do these projects in the Arctic anyway. So it seems to me they're saying that really because to kind of satisfy the activists. But it is an issue, and one that continues to be an important issue. So most of what I'm going to focus on, though, are the sustainable investing and responsible investing issues. So who is interested in ESG investing? According to research from The Economist, about 76% of younger generations in the UK say they're much more interested to consider ESG factors when investing, and that's compared to 37% of older generations. So we're talking about the highest levels of interest come from high net worth investors, millennial investors, and that's people born between 1981 and 1996, and women are apparently much more interested in it. And I have like two quotes of people who for why they want to do ESG investing. These are people who are putting their money into ESG funds. This is from a 38-year-old female yoga instructor. And she says, I do think ESG investing helps make the world a better place for everyone. We're all in this together. I'm betting on the future, that the choices I make now with my money are going to do something positive in the future. And so that's kind of gives you an example of what people think they're doing when they're putting their money in an ESG fund. They think that, yes, they can both make money in the stock market and they can do something to help better the world. Is that really true? That's what we're going to unpack today. Okay, so how does ESG investing really work? I like to call it playing the rating agency game. And I'm going to look at this from both the rating agency standpoint and also from the corporate standpoint. So what are these ESG ratings agencies? Basically, they are agencies that use proprietary research methodologies to monitor and score thousands of companies to produce material non-financial information about them. And then investors use the ratings that these companies create to construct portfolios or indices ranking and to select stocks for funds that they then term are ESG. And so on the slide, you'll see different examples of different ratings agencies. There are tons of them. MSCI is one, Sustainalytics, SASB. SASB is the one I'm going to actually be focusing on a little bit later. Institutional Shareholder Services, the UN Principles of Responsible Investment. There's tons of them, and they're totally unregulated, and they each have their own ways of determining ESG scores. So how does it work both at the corporate level and the rating agency level? And the big factor here is that there's just a total lack of standardization. So at the corporate level, companies report what they want to report and how they want to report it. Larger companies tend to have more resources to devote to reporting, and so they tend to report more data, which gives them better scores from rating agencies. So basically the way it works is the more data you report, the better the score you get. It doesn't necessarily matter what that data is, but the more you give them, the higher your score will be. There's no auditing of the data that's reported. In environmental and social areas, some governance data can be audited. Then when we look at the rating agency level, rating agencies, like I said, prioritize the amount of information that is reported. So small and mid-sized companies are at a competitive disadvantage when it comes to ESG ratings. Even though these companies create the most jobs and tend to be the most innovative, they tend to do worse in ESG ratings because they don't report as much data. Then ratings also can be based on the industry rather than on a company-specific risk. So a lot of the rating agencies will kind of give an entire industry a basic score, and so if you fall into that industry, you get that score. And that's often, by the way, how it works if companies try to report Scope 3 emissions data. Scope 3 so there's three different kinds of emissions data. There's the emissions your company produces, that's Scope 1. There's the emissions that are produced based on the products that you produce, and then there's even more. There's the emissions that other people produce using your product. So if you're an oil company and you produce oil, Scope 3 emissions would be the emissions that people who drive cars using your petroleum emit. I mean, come on. No one can accurately report their Scope 3 emissions data, so there are agencies that have basically come up with, this is what we think are the Scope 3 emissions data for this whole industry, and most people just use that. So that gives you a sense of how far afield from what might actually be occurring we tend to get. Now, a lot of these ratings agencies are not even asking for you to report Scope 3 emissions necessarily, but they do tend to give a score that can be industry-based, not necessarily company-based, especially if you're a company that doesn't report a lot of information. Okay, a little bit more on the lack of standardization. Now, the ratings agencies do sometimes claim to normalize by industry, and this gives you kind of an average ESG score by industry. So you can see utilities are getting 61, energy is getting 57. This is from Sustainalytics, not, this is just one ratings agency. And they tend to simplify a lot of things. They claim that they normalize them by industry. They don't always. Industry ratings can vary very significantly they can vary excuse me, very significantly. Now, here's a good example of the lack of standardization. So let's look at Tesla and BMW. Despite, now everyone hopefully remembers all of the issues so despite there's all sorts of environmental and ethical violations that say BMW has committed and other European automakers, this comparison makes it clear that the score is more of a reflection of the amount of information disclosed. European companies are required by the regulations in Europe to disclose a lot more information than companies based in America. So therefore, European automakers, according to some ratings agencies, are going to get better scores. So that's how Tesla ends up with a lower score than BMW, simply because BMW is a European company, and it discloses a lot more. And so you can see how, but then the scores also vary based on whether you're using a traditional ESG score like Sustainalytics or something called the Material ESG score from the SASB. So if you're using the traditional one, Volkswagen beats out Tesla, gets a better score. If you're using the material one, then Tesla beats out Volkswagen in a very significant way. So why does this happen? So the SASB awards higher value to issues like life cycle impact of products, services, and fleet emissions. And the Volkswagen emission testing scandal really hurt its score, hurt Volkswagen's score. And so these are scores based on the ratings agencies, and then financial advisors then pick and choose which scores they want to use to create ESG funds and portfolios. So that just gives you a sense of how kind of the lack of standardization that goes into this. And so I'm known for my cynical view on ESG, if that wasn't totally clear. But one of the cynical views is that ESG is really just, and this has been starting to be talked about, that ESG is really just a way of persuading young people to put money in the stock market by giving them a reason to feel good about it. Like I said, when you poll people about why they want to do ESG investing. And so I have a quote from, there's a man who was the former CIO of sustainable investing at BlackRock, and he kind of came out and said, like, it's really just marketing hype, PR spin, disingenuous. There is no evidence that by buying a low carbon ETF, you're actually going to lower emissions. You're just, feeling good about it. It also plays off the pervasiveness of politics that we see in a lot of aspects of life. You can also argue it's just a way for fund managers to sell new products and charge more for them. So those are kind of some cynical views of it. Then there's the question: do ESG funds outperform non-ESG funds? And this is a big question because it's been reported that ESG funds do outperform non-ESG funds. And the idea behind that is that if you are taking into account all of these environmental and climate risks, that your company is going to do better in the long run, and so that's why they're performing better. So a June 2020 study found that 6 out of 10 sustainable funds delivered higher returns than equivalent conventional funds over the past decade. So that's where they get this claim that they outperform. 754 Europe-based sustainable funds showed to have done better than non-ESG funds over 1, 3, 5, and 10 years. And they showed that there was also a claim that sustainable funds outpaced traditional funds during the coronavirus market sell-off with average excess returns of up to 1.83%. So that's the claim. Okay, let's unpack that. So new research in 2021 debunked this claim, that the claim that ESG funds outperform. An analysis of 24 ESG strategies that had been shown to outperform found that this was actually due to what they call quality metrics, and that when you adjust for quality metrics, the ESG strategies do not offer significant downside risk protection. And that the outperformance of ESG essentially only happened in 2013, when interest in ESG investing started to rise remarkably, meaning the returns were artificially inflated by the momentum of pushing up the value of ESG-friendly stocks. So that's why they looked like they were outperforming when, once you adjust for something called for quality metrics, they aren't actually outperforming. Then that raises the issue of the fact that ESG funds lack diversification. And this is part of my argument, which is I think that ESG investing is actually creating a fairly significant bubble. And I'm going to talk a little bit about a study by a man named Wayne Weingarten called, he did a study about this ESG investing. And he found that in the waste and clean tech sector, ESG funds averaged 48.65% committed to just the top 10 equities in the fund. In one waste and clean tech fund, EVX, he found that the top 10 equities accounted for an alarming 64% of the portfolio. So there's a real lack of diversification in these funds. And one of the reasons for it is has to do with these rating agencies. And an example of this is how these rating agencies basically foster a lack of diversification. So for example, the SASB framework, which is the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, which is the Bloomberg one, they basically foster this. So in the renewable resources and alternative energies section, they only list 3 companies. 3 companies. We all know there are a lot more companies that do, alternative energies out there. Under infrastructure, they list a whole bunch of utility companies that reported, including PSE&G, Xcel Energy, and Con Edison. These are not the funds, the companies that you would probably think of off the top of your head if you're thinking about clean tech or sustainable investing, right? SASB even lists legacy oil and gas companies like Chevron, Phillips 66, and Hess, because it's all about whether you choose to report, you choose to go through this process to get a score. They also include younger fossil fuel firms and oil services companies like Whiting Petroleum and Halliburton. So these are all companies that have that are scored and are included in the SASB framework. Now, the number of energy-related companies is pretty small, and the diversity is pretty minimal in general. Sorry, I should have flipped to that slide. Now, this is just a small, here, I want to show you, this is an example of some of the SASB sustainability accounting standards in the real estate section. I thought I'd pull those, that would be of greater interest. So this is just a very small example section of the disclosure topics and accounting metrics. And this is for the so-called materiality framework, which SASB created that claims to give much more, it claims to give a much more numerical value as opposed to the traditional methods, which were much more qualitative. So so the topics include things like water management, management of tenant sustainability impacts, and climate change adaptation. And they ask for quantitative data and qualitative descriptions for things like description of climate change risk exposure analysis, degree of systemic portfolio exposure and strategies for mitigating risks, area of properties located in 100-year flood zones by property subsector, percentage of tenants that are separately metered or submetered for 1, grid electricity consumption, and 2, water withdrawals by property subsector, percentage of new leases that contain a cost recovery clause for resource efficiency related capital improvements. So these are the kinds of things that they want to know. So if you're a company that manages these real estate, this is what they want to know about all of your properties that you own. They want a description of the water management risks. They would like your associated leased floor area by property subsector. They want to know the practices to mitigate the risks of water management. And this is just the first accounting metric. So the first metric has 8 separate parts, each with several subsections. This goes on for 27 pages and includes things like the entity shall include a discussion of its support, participation, and usage of third-party initiatives concerning green leases. I don't even know what a green lease is. I don't know, maybe you guys know what a green lease is, but I don't know. And they ask for the disclosure of climate change scenarios used to determine risks and opportunities presented by climate change, where scenarios may include but are not limited to the new policy scenario, sustainable development scenario, and current policy scenario as established by the International Energy Agency in its annual World Energy Outlook. Now, I happen to know what the SASB is talking about when they refer to the IEA and its World Energy Outlook and the different scenarios there. But that's because I do energy for a living, and that's my job to know what that is. I would not expect anybody else to know what this is or even care about it, to be frank, because it's basically a exercise in fantasy projection that the IEA goes through every year, where they say, here are 3 different scenarios for what we can expect if we actually try to get to net zero and things like that. They're really kind of exercises I see in fantasy. But the SASB is basically asking real estate property owners to take this and apply it to their properties, and to if you happen to have something, you're going through all this trouble, are you really going to go through all this trouble to get all this information to qualify for an SASB ESG rating? You could hire someone to do this, but it would probably be their full-time job. It would probably require a whole team to assemble all of this information. It's a lot of reporting and a lot of disclosures for something that isn't legally required at all. Okay, this is not like the SEC is requiring this. This is totally voluntary, with the idea that that's how you can get your company qualified to be included in some kind of ESG fund. You could just submit the information you want. You don't have to go through all of this. Just submit which ones are easiest or you want. But even if that, because remember that the frameworks award companies that submit more information, even if it's not necessarily correct. They're not going to double check you. And even if it isn't necessarily favorable, it doesn't make you look favorable to the environment, because it's all about how much you report. And that's why I call it playing the ESG, playing the rating agency's game. And that kind of gives you an example of what it's like to actually go through that process. So companies often make it seem like, so that, like I said, there are no real standards. Like the SASB sets up this very involved framework that you can go through, but it's totally voluntary. And the landscape's riddled with lots of organizations. SASB is just one. There are 10 others that have all different standards. But there are lots of companies now that you can hire to, and consultants that you can hire to offer to advise you on your ESG ratings and do ESG compliance. And companies will talk up their ESG compliance programs in ways that make it seem like compliance imposes significant changes across the value chain, when in fact, what they're really doing is organizing data and metrics into the forms that are sought by the reporting agencies or the financial institutions. So they're not necessarily replacing their entire fleet with EVs. Okay, they might say that this is a thing that they want to do in the future, but as long as they've created this standard or something, and they say that they've had this and they report it, they can satisfy this rating agency desire. So I would say at most it really involves taking into account all of the company's carbon, it can account taking into their carbon footprint, understanding where changes could make the most impact, and setting targets for emissions reductions in those areas. You don't necessarily have to meet those targets as long as you've set them. And the data is really all over the place. Like I said, an interesting fact now is that Goldman Sachs found that only 11.6% of ESG metrics were performance data related. So one of the things that has been in the news a lot recently is the firm BlackRock. So, and BlackRock has been very public about its commitment to ESG and how it's going to kind of push all sorts of CEOs of companies into being more ESG, more environmentally friendly. And I want to kind of deconstruct BlackRock's ESG claims, because I think that will really shed light on how on whether this is kind of the real deal or not. And so most ESG conscious funds aren't like as strict as the Harvard Management Company that I mentioned, where they're not saying they're divesting from fossil fuels, but they don't want to invest any more in fossil fuel companies. Some are outright hypocritical, even funds that purport to be very stringent on environmental issues. And BlackRock is known as the largest money manager in the world. It's got $9.5 trillion in assets under its control, and is well known for pushing its sustainability agenda on the companies it invests in. And for example, a very recent letter to clients claimed that Every active investment team at BlackRock considers ESG factors in its investment process and has articulated how it integrates ESG in its investment process. This is from 2020, but they were saying by the end of 2020, all active portfolios and advisor strategies will be fully ESG integrated. And it's very important to kind of parse exactly what they were saying there. So what does this actually mean? It means that portfolio managers have to manage their fund's exposure to ESG risks and have to document how ESG risk assessment is impacting their investment decisions. That's what it technically means. And the language here is very, very different from what we saw, from what Harvard said. And then they said that they went on in this letter and they said, we are in the process of removing from our discretionary active investment portfolios in the public securities, both debt and equity, of companies that generate more than 25% of their revenues from thermal coal production, which we aim to accomplish by the middle of 2020. Well, you look at that and you're like, oh my gosh, they want to divest from coal. Well, not exactly. Let's see. Is this really true? The devil is in the details. So, a year after this letter was issued, a company called Reclaim Finance released a report showing that of the $85 billion of the assets managed by BlackRock are still invested in coal companies. That's coal. Forget oil, gas, other things. This is just coal, downright coal. And not only that, but BlackRock continues to have $24 billion invested in coal companies that plan to expand their mining activities, like Sumitomo and KEPCO. So it's not just companies that continue to do coal, it's companies that want to do more coal. How does this work for BlackRock? How do they get to say we're going to stop investing in coal, but still do that? So BlackRock's policies meant it can still invest in firms that make less than 25% of their revenues from coal, like Glencore, for example. And their policy only applies to actively managed funds. This is the kicker, meaning that assets invested via passive funds can still be invested in every coal company in the world. So they can just invest in index funds, and that continues to give them exposure to coal. Now, BlackRock responded to this, and they said they did divest from companies that had more than a quarter of thermal coal revenues from their active investment strategies, and they also offer their clients the option of excluding coal from its index products. That doesn't mean that they actually did what they said they were going to do. And then they also use their investment power to vote against directors in multiple energy companies on climate grounds. But what does that actually mean? For BlackRock, it means that they generally they're just upset about the lack of disclosure on emissions data. So they'll vote against you if you're not disclosing enough information. It doesn't matter if that information is bad for the environment or whatnot. They just want you to disclose it. And so despite this very strongly worded letter, they're continuing to make substantial investments in fossil fuel companies, including coal companies. If you looked at using market values of February 2021, oil and gas represented 2.55% of BlackRock's total investments, and coal and consumable fuels made up 0.36% of the total. However, after that time, the price of oil, coal, and natural gas skyrocketed, and so it's likely that these funds make up an even larger percentage of BlackRock's total investments now. Is BlackRock going to be motivated to reduce its exposure to coal and other fossil fuels now that these companies are making a lot more money? It was easy to say we're going to get rid of all of this when oil prices were $38 a barrel because it didn't look like it was such a great investment. But then when oil prices were $100 a barrel, it seems like a much better investment. And so here's a sense of like what companies they're still invested in. So the CEO of BlackRock seems to really want US and Europe-based companies to decarbonize, but he's fine making money off of hydrocarbons elsewhere. And very famously, they invested in Saudi Aramco's natural gas pipeline network. So they bid on this investment that was supposed to make them quite a bit of money, and despite the fact that they've committed to this. So in my estimation, BlackRock is really about making money, and it was much easier to say we're reducing our exposure to fossil fuels and the like when prices were low. But once prices got higher, they're not so interested in divesting from that. And one of the interesting issues there is that if you look at, there was a Texas basically kind of called them out for this and said, well, are you going to just stop investing in all of our great oil companies? And they basically wrote a letter in February 2022 to Texas officials and Texas trade groups that said, we will continue to invest in and support fossil fuel companies, including Texas fossil fuel companies. We are perhaps the world's largest investor in fossil fuel companies. Whoa, we went suddenly in 2020 from, we got to reduce our exposure to we're the world's largest investor in fossil fuel companies. And as a long-term investor in these companies, we want to see them succeed and prosper. So all of a sudden, when they get called out for it, particularly by people, legislators or lawmakers, and as to why they don't want to support these, they suddenly are singing a different tune. And you can see from this what the top 10 holdings are, and it's not just oil companies, but specifically ones that are in Texas. So they hold stake in 9% of Phillips 66 and Occidental Petroleum, 8% in Valero Energy and ConocoPhillips, 6% in ExxonMobil. And overall, they have $260 billion invested in fossil fuel companies around the world. So that kind of deconstructs BlackRock's commitment to ESG, or commitment to the E in ESG. And so the last thing I want to just talk about a little bit is I want to go back to this bubble argument and talk about how we end up with inflated valuations. So by definition, ESG exists to give investors new criteria to consider when choosing where to place assets. At best, it offers additional criteria. At worst, it replaces traditional criteria like profit, growth, dividends, etc., with ESG standards and these very amorphous designations that we saw. Now, one of the really interesting things that we're seeing right now has to do with ERISA laws and pension funds, and how there are regulations about what can be where things can be invested in, and how things work when you talk about public sector retirement funds and pension funds and things like that. And so initially, things were basically like being funneled directly into ESG, and people weren't like being given a choice. It was just like automatically going to ESG funds. And then the Trump administration created a regulation that said that you can't just do that, that they have to go, that they have to consider, profit and growth and dividends. They have to consider that first and foremost, and then you can only consider other things like if the people elect to do that. And so you can't just automatically funnel them into something that takes things other than the amount of money into consideration. And that regulation, I think, went through, but then it was repealed by the Biden administration. So if you're public pension funds, that money can be go right into ESG funds without basically the knowledge of the people whose pension money it is. And so that's kind of a big deal, is this idea that they might be taking things other than profit, growth, dividends, et cetera. Now, the ESG core camp will argue, well, ESG is better, the funds perform better, and so you're going to get better of all of this. As we know, that's not necessarily true. But anyway, by using ESG, I think all of this can lead, and in fact may even be designed to lead to inflated valuations, because you're funneling money into certain companies, into a much smaller kind of group of companies that have been determined to be ESG. Although, like I said, just about any company can qualify as ESG if you report the right and the large amount of data. Now, even the MSCI makes the argument that more investment in ESG is needed to mitigate the risks of investing in ESG. So they actually had an urgent call by MSCI to all investment institutions worldwide to embrace this new ESG world and to mitigate the inherent risks that it brings. So they actually acknowledge that, we got to make it bigger to eliminate the risks. However, more investments and more capital only create inflated valuations and, as I argue, a bubble. Retirement funds are meant for the long term, and a policy of ESG investing would tie those funds to ESG over many years. But what if we get to a point where pro-ESG sentiment decreases? What if that's no longer the big thing? Now, it has shown, it kind of got big. It's definitely shown much more sticking power than things like big data. Remember when everything was about big data? No one talks about big data anymore, right? Or AI or whatever. So every year there's a new thing. But ESG does seem to have some sticking power. But not necessarily. It may not necessarily hold. Say it kind of decreases, and then the valuations that these companies are getting don't match the fundamentals. That bubble would be set to burst. Now, Wall Street wants more investment in ESG funds because it can charge more money for it. Sustainable funds, on average, charge about 0.61% more as compared to 0.41% for their traditional peers. So they charge more for managing, for the ESG funds. So that's my argument that we're kind of setting ourselves up for a bubble if ever sentiment does shift away from this, or at least kind of the inertia decreases, because it's only going up and up because there's more and more money being put into it. And then I just want to conclude briefly with some ongoing environment issues that are kind of facing the real estate industry. And some things that I did not really get to touch on include climate litigation. And I said this isn't really an ESG thing because it's separate, but there have been lawsuits that are filed against there's a lot of climate litigation going on. I mean, various states have filed lawsuits against, big oil companies. They're basically saying, we want you to pay for climate change damage. And so there are a lot of these lawsuits going on in the United States. But some of the more interesting ones are that we're now seeing lawsuits filed against industrial materials companies like cement manufacturers. So cement is an extremely, I guess we call it, carbon-intensive process to make. And there's actually a small Indonesian island that is suing a very large Swiss cement maker called Holcim. They're suing them for the water level that's rising and hurting their island. So these are the kind of lawsuits that we're seeing. Do they tend to go anywhere? Really only in the EU. The EU tends to kind of go somewhere with these. There was a big judgment against Shell. In the United States, they tend to get all the way to maybe the Supreme Court, and then they tend to kind of get thrown out because the truth is that they are ridiculous, and it's impossible to prove that, say, Exxon has caused a seawall in Baltimore to break. You can't prove that. Plus, you can't prove a lot of these states are on record, or these localities are on record as promoting, fossil fuel use. So they knew about this. So it's very hard to prove. But you have a lot of these very you have a lot of prosecutors that really want to, make this case and bring this lawsuit because it gets them in the news and it's good for them politically. And so you end up getting a lot of these lawsuits, and companies have to spend a lot of money fighting these lawsuits. So that's an issue, a kind of ongoing issue in terms of industrial materials. We're also seeing higher energy prices. A lot of that is due to record low investment in legacy energy. Not all of that is due to environment concerns. A lot of that low investment was due to the fact that oil prices were really low for a long time. So there just wasn't a whole lot of investment going into it because it was hard to make money on it. But there's definitely people are shying away from investing in new oil development. There's concern they might not be able to get funding. Europe is a huge issue in this. So European companies like BP and Shell are not really doing a lot of new fossil fuel development. And so it's definitely an issue. Regulations in the United States, environmental regulations are a big issue, particularly the lack of clarity in regulation is making it very difficult for oil producers to want to invest and produce more oil because they don't know what the methane regulation is going to be next week. And so that's a lot of money they have to spend. So they tend to kind of dial back on producing more oil, which is then leading to higher energy prices for everyone. And then I mentioned anti-fossil fuel legislation. We're seeing some state and local laws banning, for example, natural gas in new construction. So San Francisco is a place that's done that. Brookline, Massachusetts has done that. New York is trying to ban new natural gas hookups in new houses, which to me seems absolutely insane because it's really, really cold in upstate New York. And if you want to get into how bad electric heat pumps are, we can have that discussion another time. But I think these are just some of the ongoing environment issues that could be facing the real estate industry. And with that, I'm going to conclude, and I'm happy to take questions if there is time.
I guess I should be quiet, but you got me physically concerned. I guess I went to school in the University of Florida from 80 to 86, and I can remember being in the real estate school, and I can't remember the professor's name. It was an old law professor. I think it was like in his 90s, and I was talking about environmental issues. I was learning over biology, and he says somebody's really having an impact on your brain, like not in a good way. And I did a Google search on you, and you come up as your name. You're an advocate for the fossil fuel for these industries. So you talk about it from one side. You don't come up with a solution. You don't come up with a solution because this is all about the Wild West, right? We're coming up with these new things that we're trying to do. So I guess my question is to you is, I think the argument that we need to make sure we have enough fossil fuel and we cut things too far back, but the fact that people are investing in these things and they want them, that's what the young people want. That's what we should be teaching at this university. We shouldn't be teaching how these things is bad and taking care of the environment, social, and these other factors. These are critical to our survival. You showed that graph of the collapse of the stock market.
It's just a general graph.
But that looks like a graph of our civilization, where we are today. So we need to make changes in what we're doing. And so I think you need a rebuttal when you make your presentation, or you need to explain what you do for a living, how you make your living. I think we all need to be doing things that makes the world better.
I'm not arguing for or against that. My point is that people might think that ESG investing is making the world better, and my point is that you have to actually look at how these ratings are being given and who is and what they do to determine, well, is it actually making the world better? Because as you can see, lots of fossil fuel companies get ESG ratings. So someone might think they're investing in a clean energy fund when in fact a good portion of that money is actually being invested in ExxonMobil, for example. Now, ExxonMobil actually does a lot of research in clean energy. They, were one of the first companies to actually use solar panels to work on solar energy back in like the 1970s. So, it's not ExxonMobil is not necessarily the worst. I mean, they do a lot of research into clean energy and the like. They make most of their money, or all of their money basically, from fossil fuels. So my point is just that when you talk about ESG investing, you can't assume that it's all environmentally friendly, that a lot of it is made to make money, and there is money to be made in fossil fuels, and so you should understand the process. Maybe ESG investing isn't the best. If you really want to move away from fossil fuels, ESG investing might not be the best way to accomplish that. That's my point, is that if you break down what ESG and the E in ESG investing actually is, you'll see that it's not actually just putting money into, say, clean energy and clean tech, and it's not actually pushing companies to do more to reduce their carbon footprint. Because of the way that it's structured, it's pushing them to just report a lot of information, as opposed to necessarily do that. So the question is, does ESG investing actually have the impact that people who invest in it think it does? And my point is that it doesn't really do that. And so it may not necessarily, you may think that you're helping the world by investing in a clean tech fund when, not necessarily. That's my point about ESG.
What's your solution?
I don't think ESG is a solution to saving the world. I think there are going to be lots of great solutions, and there's a lot of great technical innovation that's going on. I don't think that the current renewable energies are sufficient to provide for our current lifestyle, but I believe in the ingenuity of the human race, and that we will find solutions that will both sustain our lifestyle and enable us to help the environment. That's,
Just quickly, I didn't see anything on there about nuclear energy, right, Tim? And things of that nature. That used to be a hot button item. Seems like all ESG is very focused on fossil fuels.
Yes.
So is there any data or anybody trying to track that?
That is a really, really good question, because there's actually a lot of really, really interesting and fascinating innovation going on in the nuclear space, like particularly when it comes to things like small modular reactors. There isn't a whole lot of nuclear stuff in ESG. I think a lot of those companies are not really reporting ESG data. If you look in the ratings agencies, it just doesn't seem like there's a whole lot going on there. I think it's a space that they really should get into, because nuclear is a really great way. It's not, I don't like to call it a green energy or necessarily a clean energy, because as we know, nuclear energy produces a lot of toxic waste that we have to account for. You can't just, spew uranium into the atmosphere or the water. You have to, but it's not necessarily, it doesn't produce a lot of carbon emissions. So that's why people refer to it sometimes as clean or green. I think it's, sometimes people refer to it as legacy energy. When I do, I mostly am talking about fossil fuels. But I think part of the issue is that nuclear is very heavily regulated both by the government and in the international sphere. And so it may be a kind of an area that the ESG ratings don't necessarily want to get too involved with, or the companies may feel like it's not in their interest to disclose data and things like that. But I would definitely say that's an area that needs to be expanded on.
You. Okay, so I want to compliment you on the presentation. ESG is barbecue sauce. That's a polite way of calling BS on something. You did a tremendous job taking it apart here. My question is, and I was with a 53-year-old REIT that got destroyed by an activist investor because as a warehouse industrial REIT, we were considered horrible ESG because we cut down trees, paved the roads, and brought diesel burning trucks in, although we did a whole lot different on that. But I didn't know if you've looked at IREM's, Institute of Real Estate Management's method for scoring real estate in property types. It's a whole lot better than the ISS and Glass Lewis. And so for those of us in the industry, we're going to have to look at the alternatives. But I really want to compliment you on what you did. But if you looked at IREM.
So I haven't looked at that, but I have looked at the ones that in the energy sphere. So that's actually a really good point that you bring up, is that, I talked all about the rating agencies in and of themselves, and they kind of impose these, they come up with their own standards that then the companies are supposed to follow. But there are also industry-specific agencies that kind of do their own ESG rating. In the oil and gas industry, they really don't do that. Like API is a big industry, and they haven't really done that. But I know in the utilities space, they do have an industry an industry organization that's created that. And so I'm assuming that what you're talking about is that kind of thing for the real estate sphere. I think those are great. The issue is making sure that the fund managers who are selecting the companies pay attention to that rating, because fund managers can take any rating. I mean, it's not like BlackRock is saying, oh, we only use SASB. They can use they can select their own ratings agencies. It's like the Wild West out there. There's no standardization or anything. So, they can use whatever they want. So a company can choose to use a standards created by their specific industry. You have to wonder whether the fund managers are going to use that when they talk about including your company in their portfolio.
My question would be if it is your personal view that proper standardization can turn this into a positive framework that it's able to actually advance this objective of improving climate goals. And
so I definitely think that standardization would go a long way, because then you'd actually be able to compare things on the same scale. But one of the issues with that is that these are not things these are not these are standards that are unrelated to like profit and things like that. And we already have a lot of standards imposed by the SEC and other things that companies have to follow. And so I'm still not sure that even if we had better standardization, it would actually lead to better outcomes. And I think that that's a whole, that's kind of the core issue of sustainable investing, or what they call, I kind of skipped this part in the talk, but what they call socially responsible or impact investing. And that actually has a long history, origins actually in the 1800s with the Methodist Church, where they would urge members not to invest in companies that involve vices like alcohol, tobacco, gambling, things like that. So there is a question of whether you can actually use investing to have a societal impact. I think we all like to believe that it can, because it kind of makes sense in our minds that, yeah, the money you invest should, how you invest it should have an impact on society. If I don't invest in this alcohol company, but I'm not sure that the data actually show that that socially responsible or impact investing actually, that you can use exclusionary or inclusionary strategies to actually do this. So I think that if we had real standards, we'd actually be able to measure whether it is something that works, as opposed to knowing that, as opposed to being sure it would work. I think if we did have more standardization, we would be able to assess whether it is a viable strategy. Thank you.